The doctors said that she carries the killer gene. She and her family carry this gene. What does that mean? Hello, welcome to another episode of Criminal Patrol. A human is, I would say, a strange creature. On one hand, he is capable of heroic sacrifices, of saving another person, sometimes even giving his life for them, donating blood to save them. He adopts other people's children. This is something great, noble, but on the other hand, the history of humanity is, after all, a history of wars. When you enter an armament museum or the Polish Army Museum, then we see that throughout the centuries, people have never put more effort into anything than figuring out how to kill another person. Faster, better, more effectively, and in such large quantities. As I said, the history of mankind is the history of wars. Every year, around 1.5 million people die worldwide as a result of various kinds of murders, killings, and vendettas. So, in a way, we are used to the fact that violence happens around us, that harm occurs, that people kill each other. Even in the book of Genesis, as we remember, Cain killed Abel, and statistically speaking. Well, in this way, he wiped out 1/4 of the world's population at that time. Of course, I'm saying this a bit tongue-in-cheek. But it also occurred to us that very often when we talk about these stories, especially those involving children, about cruel crimes affecting innocent people, well, you often write in the comments, why does this happen? How could this person do it? You're outraged. And of course, that's right, and that's how it should be. So, as you can hear from what I'm saying, how should we get used to the fact that people can also be bad?
Have you ever wondered what really goes on in a murderer's mind? Is evil a trait only of monsters, or is it something that lies dormant in each of us? That's exactly what the new release from Feria Publishing is about, the book Why Are We Psychopaths, Murderers and Sadists? Its author, Professor Lauri Numenmaa, is an outstanding psychologist and neuroscientist who breaks down cruelty into its basic components. The book Why Are We Psychopaths? The book Why Are We Psychopaths? Its author, Professor Numenmaa, psychologist Numenmaa, explains where the lack of empathy comes from and why, under the right conditions, almost anyone can cross moral boundaries. Importantly, the author includes hard data with historical examples that read like a gripping crime novel. If you're looking for substantive answers to questions about the dark side of human nature, this is a must-read. You'll find the link to it in the description below the video.
Very often we wonder what goes on in the minds of such serial killers, or in general, what goes on in the minds of murderers we often talk about. What goes on in the minds of dictators like Hitler, Stalin, or the now forgotten Mao Zedong, who killed nearly 70 million people. Today, he is rarely mentioned, and this book is an attempt to answer the questions we all ask ourselves. Why does this happen? Why do people act this way? Well, we've learned a bit about how to explain it. We know biology, we know psychology, so in some ways we can partially explain it. I say partially because in the end it's never fully possible to explain it. Just like I think in the situation or in the story that I'm about to tell you in a moment, of course we all know Ted Bundy, we all know the Obama and other serial killers like that. But I think few of you know the story of a certain lady who became famous in the United States. She is basically in every textbook on psychology or forensic psychiatry. The lady became known in America as Tillie Klimek, but here in Poland she was known as Tosiak Burek because that was her real name, Tosiak Burek. She lived in a small hamlet called Rowienica in the Kujawian-Pomeranian Voivodeship. Today, she is actually the most famous among all those dark figures that existed in the world. Teofila Geburek was born in 1977, right here in Poland, in the town of Rowienice, in the Kujawian-Pomeranian region. As I told you, the family was poor, so they decided to move to the United States. This happened in 1880. Tosia was born in Poland, as well as her brother Andrzej, while the remaining 5 siblings were born in the United States. They boarded a ship, sailed to America, and of course in America they landed in Chicago. That's where they started their lives and tried to settle down in some way. A poor Catholic family. Basically, life was very hard for them, but somehow they managed. It was important, at least that's what Tosia's parents thought, that she should marry well, that she should find a good husband. So she had to have all those qualities that are very important for a woman, a housewife. Of course, she had to know how to cook, because her mother believed that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, and indeed, her mother was a good cook and also taught little Tosia. Tosia learned to bake all kinds of things, to cook, and she especially liked to prepare dishes with duck or beef. Very quickly, at just a few years old, she became an excellent cook, and even the neighbors appreciated it. They thought that she really cooked very well, even though she was still a child. And that was her great attribute, this cooking, preparing dishes. It was really her main attribute. When she was 14 years old, the first suitor appeared. Indeed, Mr. Joseph Mitkiewicz, that was his name, this respectable man, had a good profession, a well-mannered person. The only thing was, he was 23 years older than Tosia. She was only 14 at the time. But he decided that he would wait those 4 years until Tosia turned 18, and then they would get married. And that's exactly what happened. Tosia turned 18 and he was already over 40. And they got married. And for over a dozen years they lived together quite well. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy was named Josef after his father, and the girl was named Teofila after her mother. And it seemed that this relationship would last until the moment when Tosia, by then a woman, Teofila, began to have a certain kind of vision. At that time, Teofila also stopped using that name because they moved to another house. Some of their neighbors were already Americans, so she decided she had to change her name. And then she became Tillie, because that's how she introduced herself as Tillie, and that's how she was known. Among her neighbors, she also met her distant cousin, basically, who had moved to the United States earlier. Nellie Kulik. Nellie Kulik also became, for her, a bit of a confidant and also a bit of a teacher in cooking. She was also great at preparing dishes. Nellie was an experienced, I would say, cook, that's one thing. And secondly, she was also experienced in life because she had already buried 2 husbands and had 13 children. Well, the 2 ladies spent a lot of time together then, during that period, when Tillie was already about 37 years old. She told the neighbors that she had a kind of visions, that these were prophetic visions, that she had become a clairvoyant, that she could predict the future. Well, esotericism was really fashionable at that time, and quite a few people were involved in it. Summoning spirits, well, that was quite common in every community, so a bit. The neighbors looked at her with a bit of skepticism, but they started to get curious, because these visions concerned not only the deaths of animals, most often dogs of the neighbors, but they also concerned people. One such vision concerned her husband, Joseph. She said that her husband would die soon, and she even predicted the exact date. Her husband, Mr. Joseph, was a bit surprised. He was almost 60, but he felt fine and had no health problems. However, after some time, he really did start to feel unwell and became weak. He ended up in the hospital where he was put on a diet, and after that diet in the hospital he got better. He returned home. But he missed those delicious dinners his wife made, so he started eating them again, and once more he began to feel unwell. His condition worsened. He ended up bedridden, and indeed on January 14, 1914, he passed away. There was surprise among the neighbors because in fact his wife had accurately predicted the date of his death. Of course, they called the doctor. The doctor came and determined that Tillie's husband had something wrong with his heart. It was probably a heart attack, and he was classified as someone who simply died. Unfortunately, Tillie wasn't a widow for long, because just 2 months later she got married again. Well, at that time another potential husband appeared on the horizon, Józef Guskowski, who, well, valued his freedom and appreciated being a bachelor. Tillie suited him as a lover. But nothing more. He simply had no intention of getting married and didn't want to hear about any wedding. Tillie insisted on having a husband. She talked him into getting married, but Guskowski absolutely didn't want to hear about it. So she decided that she would take him to Milwaukee. It was supposed to be a romantic trip. She rented a hotel there, and they actually went to Milwaukee together. They spent a lot of time there. They were in that hotel. She was hoping that just by being there on that trip, he would propose to her and then go back to his place. As Joseph's fiancé, but nothing like that happened. Joseph still insisted on his decision and didn't want to get married. And then Tillie decided to risk everything on one card. She told him that if he didn't marry her, she would do what she did with her 2 previous husbands. When he asked her what, she told him she'd kill him. Well, of course. Joseph got scared. He absolutely didn't want to think about marrying her, and he just wanted to get out of the relationship. That's when Tillie started to blackmail him. At that time, there was still a law in the United States, the Mann Act, which was, of course, aimed at fighting prostitution and human trafficking. It meant that if someone traveled to another state for, well, unethical purposes without permission, they could simply end up in prison. And it really was a very strict law. Many men ended up in prison under this law, including Charlie Chaplin, who was put behind bars. Under this very act, the law was only abolished in 1978, so relatively recently. Well, Joseph got scared because he knew that if Tillie reported him to the police, he could end up behind bars. In the end, both of them decided, or at least it seemed so, that Joseph wouldn't get married and Tillie wouldn't push him. He and his sister Stella came together for such a delicious lunch. They both ate it, and not long after that lunch, Joseph passed away. Well, again, it seemed to be a natural death. The doctor stated that there was nothing suspicious about this death. And Tillie started looking for another candidate for a husband. Well, no one showed up. For a while, some men started to avoid her. She had various lovers, including Mr. Majors. Mr. Majors was with her for a while. They lived together. But unfortunately, after some time, Majors also died. The next candidate for her third husband was Franciszek Kupczyk. Again, a very calm and hard-working man. He went to work every day. But when he left for work, some men would show up at Tillie's house. Well, everything pointed to this. The neighbors said that fidelity was not really her strong suit, but the marriage lasted more than 2 years. However, after 2 years, Tillie started having visions again. She began visiting the neighbors and said that she had such a vision. In her predictions, she saw her husband, Trooper Blady, lying in a coffin, which meant that he would probably die soon. Again, there was surprise because Franciszek didn't feel bad either. He was in good shape. But that's the vision she had, and the neighbors already knew that there might be something to such visions. She decided to buy a coffin, even though her husband was still alive. She decided to buy a coffin, and that's because there was a sale, a bargain, $30 for a coffin. She went to the store and bought the coffin. On the way, she met her neighbor. Becky didn't like this woman because she once made fun of her appearance, mocked her. How does this Polish woman look? How does she speak with that broken English? Tillie couldn't stand her, almost to the point of being sick. She bought that coffin, brought it home. There was a shared basement, and then there was a huge quarrel with another neighbor, with Marta Wesolek, because Marta Wesolek didn't want to agree to having the coffin in the basement. She tried to convince Tillie by shouting to take the coffin away, but she insisted, and the coffin stayed in the basement. She was simply waiting for non-death, for a specific date of her husband's death. Indeed, Franciszek started feeling unwell sometime in April. His pain kept getting worse, and finally on April 20th, just as his wife had predicted, Franciszek died. Of course, a doctor was called, and this time the doctor didn't find anything alarming. It seemed that these were some kind of disease-related changes, and that's why Franciszek died. Of course, just like her previous husbands in Rzeszów, he left his wife an insurance policy. That was quite a lot of money. Besides, every time she also convinced her husbands that since they weren't feeling well, and you never know what might happen, they should increase the amount of their insurance. And they really did it that way. Each time she ended up with quite a lot of money. In April 2021, Tillie's third husband, this time Franciszek, died. A lot of money, money, money. People back then, and I'm thinking about the neighbors here, really got scared because they decided that her predictions were so precise that she probably had contact with some kind of witchcraft. She started to be seen more as a witch than as a visionary or a clairvoyant. She was considered a witch, a sorceress. People started to be afraid of her. Well, they thought that after something like that, after burying her third husband, there wouldn't be a candidate number 4. Well, they were surprised because candidate number 4 basically appeared on the day of the funeral. That was Klimek, who was probably an acquaintance of her late husband. He liked the widow. And 3 months later, after she buried husband number 3, she married husband number 4. That is Klimek. She was a bit disappointed because it turned out that Joseph first of all liked moonshine and liked to drink it in excess. Besides that, he also looked at other women. Well, she was jealous, so he couldn't be a husband. So she decided that it was time to get rid of him as well. She was also in constant contact with that Nelly Kulik, her cousin whom she asked for advice. And that's when she also told her that she had to get rid of Joseph. To which Nelly said that it would be good to use that for this purpose. Rat poison. Basically, she prepared the rat poison herself, a bit of soot and a bit of arsenic, just enough so that no one would notice, and that poison. Tillie would add it to her husband's food, most often to the bigos. He loved bigos, and she made excellent bigos. Her bigos was probably famous all over Chicago. As many people said, it was excellently prepared, but this time it was made with a bit of arsenic. Joseph started feeling unwell. He began to weaken, even though he was as healthy as a horse. Everyone started to wonder what was going on. His brother, despite Tillie's objections, decided to call a doctor. The doctor arrived, did all the necessary tests, and then it turned out that it wasn't just indigestion, that it wasn't some virus as they suspected, but that he had simply been poisoned with arsenic. Joseph also ended up in the hospital at that time, and the doctors actually confirmed that this patient had been poisoned with arsenic for a long time. October 27, 1921. That year, Joseph's doctor and brother decided to notify the police. The police officers were a bit surprised, but they still thought there might be something to it. Besides, Tillie confessed to it after 18 hours of interrogation, when they really started questioning her. She confessed that she had tried to kill her husband and that she got the poison from her cousin. She probably hoped at that time that the police would only focus on the attempted poisoning case, that they wouldn't look into any other stories, into her other relationships, but she miscalculated. The police concluded that since she tried to poison husband number 4, it's not out of the question. Looking at the fact that the other husbands died such sudden and violent deaths, maybe there's something to it? An exhumation was ordered. All 3 remaining husbands were dug up from their graves, and it turned out that all 3 of them had also been poisoned with arsenic. Well, that was something. The press found out about it. They started writing. Journalists began to repeat all this information. Tillie became famous, but it also gave rise to checking whether perhaps such an event that in the same age, there were more of these various kinds of deaths around Tillie. They started analyzing all those cases where someone from Tillie's surroundings died. And here it turned out that not only Tillie's husbands died under strange circumstances, but also her neighbors, her acquaintances, and even members of her family. What's more, they were her brothers and sisters. A total of 20 people were identified, 20 cases in which arsenic could have been used by Tillie. In total, 13 such cases of death were proven. Among them, well, there were of course husbands, but there were also 4 siblings. Tillie poisoned her brothers and sisters simply because she had an argument with her mother. But in all this, there were also those lovers, Mr. Majers, Gruskowski, those men who appeared in her life. Of course, it was impossible to open all of them because it was impossible to find all the men she had dealt with, but there were really a lot of them also here. Her victims were those 2 ladies. One was Betty, who made fun of her, and the other was Marta Veselek, who didn't let her hide the coffin. Fortunately, both women survived because there wasn't enough arsenic. She had 2 methods. First, she used a long-term method, and then she would add arsenic to her delicious stew. Or she would make special candies and give them to those she didn't like and simply wanted to get rid of. Well, you could say she murdered on a massive scale. She killed everyone she didn't like, those who wronged her, or even those who didn't, or simply those she had a bad opinion of. In March 1923, Tillie's trial began, yes. Along with her, her cousin was also arrested, that Nellie Kulik. It turned out that Nellie Kulik was also suspected of killing members of her own family. First, she killed 2 of her children, then she killed her husband and tried to kill 2 more of her children. Well, that was something I would say terrifying, a shock throughout all of America. 2 such poisoners, 2 people who were considered normal housewives in their community, turned out to be murderers. Without scruples, both of them were sentenced to life imprisonment. While Tillie actually died in prison in 1936, she was 59 years old and died of a heart attack. Nellie, her cousin, was released from prison after just 1 year. Why did that happen? Well, it's not entirely clear whether the evidence against her was too weak or if there was something else going on. But the fact is that despite being sentenced to life in prison, Nellie was released from prison. Tillie Klimek is the most famous murderous serial killer in the history of the United States, which is why she appears in all the psychology textbooks, in criminology textbooks, and her legend, so to speak, is still alive. During the trial, she was also examined, and doctors determined that she carried the murderer gene. She and her family carry such a gene. What does that mean? Well, it's hard to say exactly from today's point of view. Presumably, something like a murder gene probably doesn't exist, but that's also where we started. This, on one hand, is wonderful, but on the other hand is bad. And why did that little girl from today's Kuyavian Pomeranian voivodeship, that little Tosia Gaburek, become a serial killer? Why did she suddenly turn into such a human beast? It's rather hard to answer that, and it's difficult to fit this case into any kind of template. Why did it happen? Well, I think that's an open question. And that's it for today's episode. Of course, subscribe to our channel, and as always, take care.